Good morning. Welcome to Ceramic Storytime with Sue. That's me, Sue McLeod. So today I'm going to read my blog post called Are You Mixing Your Glazes Well Enough? And so this post is just about the importance of mixing your glazes really well and what can happen if you don't have a high-speed mixer. A lot of people who use a community studio are just will just stir their glazes like at my work. And so I did a little experiment to show like how long you need to be mixing your glazes for in order to get the glaze completely homogenized. So, and just let me know you can hear me. Last week, my sound wasn't working, and it looked like it was working on my end, but everyone let me know that there was no sound. So I just want to, oh, hi, Shelly. Shelly, you can hear me. That's, pardon me. That's awesome. Yeah, so if my sound and video are both working, then that is wonderful news. Technology's on my side this week, so I'm going to get started. And so as I read, I'm going to read my blog post, Are You Mixing Your Glazes Well Enough? And so as I'm reading, feel free to ask questions in the comments, and then I can answer them as we go. Oh, Michael's here. Sound is fine. Perfect. Thank you guys for confirming. I would hate to read a full blog post and find out that nobody could hear me. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen now. And if you want to follow along, you can go to this link, bit.ly/mix glazes well. And that is just a short link that will take you to this blog post here. So we've got... my blog post should be on the right side of the screen, and then you should be able to see me on the left. Okay, so are you mixing your glazes well enough? That is the question. So if you go to this blog post, you can also download a PDF and keep it in your files. So if you find this to be helpful and you want to save it, then just click this little link here, and then you can download this as a PDF. And then once I'm finished recording this video, I will be uploading the video and an audio version onto this blog post here. So, so you'll be able to watch it later or listen to it on your phone or something when you're walking or while you're in your studio. That would be awesome. All right, let's start. So glaze results on the thin side. As a studio technician at a busy pottery studio, it's my job to mix and maintain 20 different studio glazes. I'm also the one studio users often go to for help when their glazes don't work out as they had hoped. Every now and then, someone will show me their finished piece where the glaze doesn't quite look right. As soon as I see it, I can tell that the issue is glaze thickness. The glaze application layer is way too thin. And there are two common reasons why the application could be too thin. Number one, the glaze contains too much water, making it thin and watery in the bucket. This means that the specific gravity needs to be adjusted. And then issue number two is the glaze was applied too thinly. So issue number one, specific gravity in our studio is controlled by the technicians. So myself and there are 3 other technicians that also work there. So if it's a specific gravity issue where there's too much water in a glaze, then that's our job to solve. But if the glaze was just applied too thinly, then that issue is controlled by the users of the glaze. So in order to determine which issue we're dealing with, I'll measure the specific gravity of the glaze. This process tells me whether the water content is too high or too low. And if you want to learn how to measure specific gravity, you can download my free guide. So you can either go to this blog blog post here, or you can go to suemcleodceramics.com/SG guide. SG stands for specific gravity. And I have a free guide that will walk you through the steps for measuring specific gravity. So when I measure the specific gravity and it's where it should be, then I know that the glaze was just applied too thinly. If the glaze is brushed on or sprayed on, it could be too thin because not enough coats were applied. But a glaze that has the right amount of water and is applied by dipping is rarely too thin. It's usually too thick because it was held in for too long. Generally, like in a public studio, this is what I find, that usually we have results that are too thick versus too thin. And especially with beginners, it's hard to like dip your piece really quickly. And so oftentimes the piece gets held in the glaze for too long and then the results are too thick. So how can it be too thin? The number one reason why a dipping glaze is applied too thinly is inadequate mixing. So glaze particles will settle. So this is how glazes work. Take a minute to think about what glazes are made of. They're solid particles suspended in water. Some solid particles are heavy and sink to the bottom of the bucket quickly. Others are light and take some time to settle. But all of our glaze particles are heavier than water and will settle eventually. An undisturbed bucket of glaze that's been sitting long enough will have a layer of water on the top and solid particles sitting under the water. The heaviest particles will sink to the bottom and the lighter particles will layer themselves on top. So just like this photograph here, we have a glaze that's been sitting for a while. And you can see that there are these layers of glaze particles. So we've got the heaviest particles on the bottom, and then these are a little bit lighter, and then the lightest particles are sitting on top. This would likely be the EPK. So the clay particles are the lightest. They sit on top, and then we've got a layer of water on top. So you can see that this glaze is not homogenized. So in order for the glaze to fire as intended, the proportion of particles applied to the piece must be equivalent to the glaze recipe. Glaze recipes are formulated very carefully so the glaze will melt at a specific temperature and will appear a certain way. If you dip a piece of pottery into the top of the bucket when the heavy particles have sunk to the bottom and the water has risen to the top, then the application layer will have too much water. So if you imagine dipping your piece into this without mixing, you're going to get a whole lot of water, a bunch of EPK particles, and then you're going to miss out on all of the, this is all probably the fluxes down here. Let's see. The application will have too much water, not enough solid particles, and the proportion of solid particles will be out of whack. So you're not going to get the glaze, the recipe, in the same proportions that it was intended. The heavy particles, light particles, and water must be mixed together really well so the glaze becomes homogenized. This means that every inch of the glaze bucket has the same composition. The top of the bucket is equal to the bottom of the bucket. This way you get the correct proportion of solid glaze particles on your piece and the correct proportion of solid particles to water, so your application layer isn't too thin. So how do we fix this issue? So the number one way to make sure your glaze is homogenized is to use a high-speed mixer if you have one. The way to achieve this is to mix your glaze really well. A high-speed mixer is ideal, and I recommend high-speed mixing glazes at the beginning of every glaze session. Examples of high-speed mixers are a drill with a paint mixing attachment or a hand or immersion blender. So this is an immersion blender or a hand blender. And then this is my cordless drill. I have this little teeny tiny paint mixing attachment. And I also have these mixing attachments in various sizes. So I have a medium one and then a big one for large buckets. So this photo shows a small mixing attachment and a cordless drill that I use for test size batches. For larger batches, I use a corded drill because it has more power and a large paint mixer attachment. During a typical glazing session, I will high-speed mix each glaze once, and then I'll use a manual mixing device like a rubber spatula in between dips. The initial blending is important, especially if your glaze has been sitting still for a few days or more. If my glazing session takes more than a couple of hours, I will often high-speed mix again partway through just to be sure. But what if you don't have access to a high-speed mixer? So the people who use the studio where I work, they wouldn't be able to high-speed mix the glazes themselves. They just have these manual stirring devices. So we're going to talk about that. If you have your own studio space with your own tools and your own glazes, I recommend getting a high-speed mixer if you don't have one. Hand blenders are often abundant in secondhand shops, and so they should be fairly affordable. Is it really necessary? Think about the difference between beating eggs with a fork versus with an electric egg beater. High speed is way faster and way more effective. But you might work in a studio where you don't have access to a high-speed mixing device, and it wouldn't be appropriate for you to bring your own. In this case, it's up to you to use the mixing tools that are available to you and mix as well as you can. The best way to do this is just to keep on stirring. When you think it's been mixed enough, don't stop, keep stirring. Most people, myself included, are naturally inclined to stir a bucket of glaze for 10 to 20 seconds. I witness a lot of glaze bucket stirring, and I also time myself to see when I would naturally want to stop mixing. I stopped at 20 seconds, and I would consider myself on the thorough side, making sure to scrape the whole bottom and the sides and mix it all in. It turns out that this isn't quite long enough for our glaze batch size with our existing mixing sticks. So how long is enough time? Well, there is only one way to find out. I did a stirring experiment. Pardon me. In order to show our studio users the importance of mixing well, I took one of our studio glazes and did an experiment. You can do this experiment with your glazes too. I chose our sapphire blue glaze that contains 4% rutile and appears very different when it's thin versus thick. I used the stirring stick that is provided in our studio, which is a 1.5-inch dowel. The glaze bucket is a 30-gallon gray plastic garbage can. The bottom isn't flat. It has a hump in the center with like a moat around it. Maybe you know the ones. And the glaze batch size is around 20 kilograms. Excuse me. So, first of all, I stirred the glaze for 10 seconds, going back and forth, side to side, front to back, over the hump, around the moat, clockwise, counterclockwise. It seemed like a fairly solid effort. I stopped stirring and quickly dipped a test tile, holding it in for 6 seconds. I immediately resumed mixing for another 20 seconds, for 30 seconds of mixing in total. I stopped stirring, dipped another test tile for 6 seconds, and then started stirring again. This time, I stirred for 30 more seconds for a total of 60 seconds. This felt like a really long time to be mixing. My goldfish brain started to get bored, but I kept mixing. So they say goldfish have about an 8-second attention span, and so do people sometimes. So when I finally got to 60 seconds, I dipped a third test tile for 6 seconds and called it a day. And so I put those test tiles in the kiln, and this is what the results were. So the above image shows the fired results and a great visual example of the effectiveness of mixing. So this test tile on the left was mixed for 10 seconds. The one in the middle was mixed for 30 seconds, and then the one on the right was mixed for 60 seconds. As you can see, 10 seconds is definitely not enough time to bring all of those heavier particles up to the top. It's very thin, too much water at the top of the bucket. So you can see on this test tile, it's barely blue. There's this little tiny spot of blue here where there's like a thicker little drip, but this glaze was not mixed well enough. At 30 seconds, it's much closer to being well mixed, but when you compare the 30-second test tile to the 60-second test tile, you can see that the 30 seconds is not quite homogenized yet. It's a bit splotchy. You can see this glaze is green where it's thin, and then it's blue where it's thicker. So you're still getting quite a lot of these thinner areas at 30 seconds. At 60 seconds, the glaze is quite uniform from the top of the tile to the bottom. This is ideal. If you want variation with the thickness, you can do that intentionally using different application methods. You don't want to undermix your glaze in order to have a thinner application. It's better to mix your glaze really well and then apply a thin application on purpose if that's what you're going for. So after the initial mix, you generally won't need to mix that much again throughout the glazing process unless it's a long glazing session. In between dips, 5 to 10 seconds should be plenty. So yeah, I would recommend doing like the initial, when you first get to your glazes, doing the initial really thorough mixing. And then as you're glazing multiple pieces, then 5 to 10 seconds of mixing in between dips is probably going to be enough. And yes, I do stir the glaze before each and every dip. It only takes a few seconds for the particles to start settling again. Just keep stirring. So based on these results at our studio, I recommend stirring each bucket for at least 60 seconds before glazing. And the time can vary for different size glaze batches and different stirring devices. So in our studio, they're just these dowels. And so there's no like flat surface. So they're not the most effective mixers. So if you are using something that, moves the liquid around a little more effectively, you might not need to stir for 60 seconds. But the best way to find out is just to do a test like I have done. A fun thing to do is find a 60-second tune that you can sing or hum while you're stirring. So as a hint, the intro to Queen's Bohemian Rhapsody is pretty close, and so is the chorus of Dancing Queen by ABBA. So those are fun songs that you can sing for 60 seconds while you're mixing. If the glaze sits more than a couple of hours, I would give it another 60-second stir before using it again. Now I have a visual example that I can show people when I suspect their glaze wasn't mixed well enough. Seeing the visual results of this test is really helpful to demonstrate the importance of mixing well. Remember, 60-second stirring is only applicable if you don't have access to a high-speed mixer. With a high-speed mixer, it's even more effective and much faster. So I definitely recommend getting a high-speed mixer and using that if you can. But if you're going old-fashioned, then just keep stirring. And there we have it. So if you have any questions or comments, please post them in the comment section, and I would be happy to answer them. Let me know if you generally use a high-speed mixer when you're mixing your glazes, or if you are manually stirring. What kind of stirring device are you using? And if you decide to do an experiment like this, I would love it if you could post your results in the Facebook group here and just show us, because different glazes are going to show these results differently. So I specifically chose this glaze because it's a really good example of what, like, when the results are too thin, it really shows it's a completely different color than when the results are just right. And so this is usually what people are going for when they mix this, when they use this glaze. And so when the results come out like this, then it's quite obvious that the glaze was just applied too thinly. So I don't see any questions. I see an LOL. So something I said was funny. And you're welcome to, if you're watching the replay, just comment and I will reply in the comments to you. And I hope you all have a wonderful Friday. And remember, just keep mixing. Shelley says, so helpful. Thank you, Sue. I use a drill with a mixing attachment, but we'll have to sing next time because most likely it's too short. Yes, and singing is always a good idea, no matter what you're doing. Michael asked what recipe this is. So this is called Sapphire Blue. If you're on the blog post, there's a link to the recipe under the heading A Stirring Experiment, or you can go to glazy.org and search for Sapphire Blue, Cedar Hill, it would say. Cedar Hill is the studio where I work. So it's the Cedar Hill Sapphire Blue Glaze. Russ says, thanks, Sue, for the reminder. You're the best. Thanks, Russ, for participating in my story times. I really appreciate you guys that showed up live for me today. And I think that's it. So I hope you have a good day, and I will see you on Facebook. Bye.